You can see here times arete same as I just explained. On the portrayal of virtue in Plato's Protagoras in the context of wider Platonic and Socratic doctrine, you can see immediately that this is quite an esoteric, isolated academic title. And you'd be forgiven for asking me why do I bother with that? Why do I bother with doing an EPQ on such an isolated title? Well, I'll explain to you my goals. First of all, I wanted to really explore a Platonic dialogue. I read a bit of Plato here and there casually, you know, but I hadn't really sort of gotten down and parsed and construed it bit by bit. And this was the intellectual exercise that I wanted to undertake. That's reason number one. Reason number two is to understand what Socrates and Plato thought about virtue. Now the concept of virtue, it's a way of thinking about morality. Broadly speaking, I think there are three ways of thinking about morality. You can think that good and bad exists in actions, which is like Kant, like the Bible, like the Quran. This is categorical moral reasoning. You can think about right and wrong being in the ends, in the aim. That's like Bentham, Mill, utilitarianism. But then there's this sort of thinking about right and wrong existing in the agent. And that's what virtue ethics sort of is. And that's sort of goal number two, to really sort of get to know how the Greeks thought about virtue ethics. And lastly, I wanted to get some measure of experience during a research project, sort of getting the references, the citations, the quotations, the time management, all the rest of the assessment objectives. Those are my goals. That's what I set out to do. What were the problems that I faced, and what did I try to do to overcome them? Firstly, primarily, well, the greatest problem, rather nebulously, was the sheer intellectual challenge. I'm not ashamed to say. Now, reading a Platonic dialogue and really thinking very hard about it is as Meno describes having a conversation with Socrates. It is like being stung by a stingray. You find yourself numb. It's very intellectually challenging. And to sort of compound this problem, I haven't had any formal instruction in philosophy. I haven't been taught philosophy or Plato or Socrates. And so to sort of get around this, I had to just read a lot. And in that, I'm indebted greatly to Taylor, Jowett, Russell, Livingston, and a lot of JSTOR papers. And if you want to look into this sort of thing, those are great names, and you should look them up. And also, I should like to extend my thanks to Ms. Lamb, who provided very valuable counsel when I went to her for guidance. That's sort of problem number two and solution number two. Thirdly, as I said before, it's a great intellectual challenge, and part of this is because of the sheer plethora of angles that you can explore, the sheer amount of material that it covers, that a Platonic text covers. And, well, the problem here is that I found it quite difficult to find a title that encompassed all the ideas that I wanted to get down in this research paper. But I have come up with one, and I hope you'll see how I cover what I want. Sort of linked to this is the fact that because there are so many threads of argument, so many strands of thought, as soon as you sort of, you may pick up one, you may achieve a moment of lucidity. But like combating the Hydra, so as you move on to the next, you lose the first. And so you find that these moments of lucidity are all fleeting. And to sort of get around that, I've started taking things down in a notebook, as you can see. Unstructured notes, but it provides a basis for me to construct my thinking with that. So that was pretty cool. And lastly, there's the matter that I'm no student of ancient Greek. Plato wrote in ancient Greek, and I was sort of in danger of missing some cultural and linguistic nuances. To get around this, I read multiple translations, I referred to other people's critical analyses, and had a look at glossaries of terms, and I hope that has circumvented that problem. So sort of now, at the closing stage of my project, what do I think are the failures and successes of my project? Well, firstly, and sort of quite silly is the fact that I spent more time amassing and sort of finding materials than I actually did digesting and reading them. So I have this great big pile of papers and books, but I haven't read them all. That's a great shame, but I suppose it's all a learning process. Secondly, and in the same vein, I left off writing the Glasgow thing into pretty much the end. So that's a failure of time management, but once again, the whole point is it's a learning process. But I think on the bright side, in the main, I have achieved what I set out to achieve. I've done pretty much what I wanted to do. And I've seen and learned, and I've been amazed by the sheer amount you can extract from a teensy-wincy little book such that Protagoras is. And it's a great experience, sort of just pushing your mind. It's a joy of learning and thinking. And I can really understand why Aristotle thought that the contemplative activity was the highest form that man can aspire to. So that's enough about the project. Let's get on to the subject. So we come to our cast of characters, our dramatis persona. In the bottom left you see Socrates. He's sort of like the hero of the dialogue. He did exist in real life, lived around 4th and 3rd centuries BC, if I can just check it correct, yep. And he was Plato, who's top there, he was Plato's mentor. Now Socrates spent his life going around sort of asking questions about virtue, justice, the soul, and people found they couldn't really answer these questions. And people got annoyed, and eventually Athens put him to death for corrupting the youth. And in some sense, he's sort of one of the first great martyrs. But anyway, enough about him. Plato, Socrates' pupil, wrote dialogues in which Socrates talks to people about virtue, justice, and the soul and such like. And that's pretty much where we get what we know about Socrates' philosophy. Now, there's a bit of a problem in this, because towards the sort of later Platonic dialogues, we find that, well, we think that the character of Socrates in these later dialogues is rather a mouthpiece for Plato's ideas than sort of an accurate portrayal of perhaps what Socrates himself said. And the same problem exists with Protagoras, the dialogue Protagoras. And sort of how I propose to avoid this problem is I shan't tackle head-on whether Protagoras is a Socratic dialogue or a Platonic dialogue. Rather, I'll just think of the character of Socrates in isolation and then compare him to the other character, So last we have our eponymous hero, Protagoras. Now, who is Protagoras? Protagoras was a sophist. He was the leading sophist of the day. And what is a sophist? A sophist is an itinerant teacher. That means he goes around professing to teach in return for a fee. Protagoras, well, yeah, he was one of the leading figures of the day, leading thinkers of the day, and he's still famous today. And we remember him for the adage, well, I remember him for the adage, man is the measure of all things. And what this displays is a profound relativism. Man is the measure of all things, there's no absoluteness. And how does this relate to the topic at hand? Well, if there's no absolute virtue, well, there's a sort of virtue relative to every community, and it's important to bear that in mind. At the same time, it is important to bear in mind that he teaches for a living. He teaches virtue for a living, and so that means, first of all, that he needs to make sure people believe that he can teach virtue, and that virtue indeed can be taught. And second of all, that the brand of virtue that he professes to teach is a brand of virtue that people want to be taught. So those are things you should bear in mind about Protagoras as we go through this investigation. So to the central concept of my investigation, arete. What is arete? Arete, roughly translated from the Greek, is virtue, but this is an imperfect, an incomplete translation. It refers to more than simply virtue. The Greeks held that every being had a purpose, a function at which it could excel. So everything has sort of a raison d'être, And its purpose in existence is to find this arete and to achieve it. So that's sort of broadly speaking what arete is. Thirsty. So what did Protagoras think about arete? Well, Protagoras taught rhetoric and debating, because that's the sort of skill that you require to succeed in Athenian democracy. And in his words, or rather in his words and in Protagoras, and this is the prudence in affairs private as well as public. A student of mine will learn to order his own house in the best manner, and he will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state. And so this is sort of, you see, Protagoras thinks of a man's function, a man's arete, as citizenship, as political skill. And you sort of see where he's coming from, because man uniquely of the animals is a social creature. Man lives in communities, other animals don't really. And so you can sort of see why this is this would be thought to be the unique expression of a human's function. So Protagoras sets out his stance. He thinks that he can teach this political skill. Well, Socrates turns around and says, well, can you, Protagoras? Because I look at Athenian democracy, and although the Athenian democracy, although in their assemblies, in matters of shipbuilding and architecture, they send for the best shipbuilders and architects, when it comes to the matters of political excellence, when it comes to matters of statesmanship, they accept the views of anyone. They accept the counsel of all of the citizens, no matter whether it be poor or rich or old or young or a carpenter or what have you. And so does this not suggest that while the Athenians who are viewed as an intelligent, a wise race, does this not suggest that while they believe that in things like shipbuilding and architecture you can have experts, in politics, in statesmanship, you cannot have an expert because they do not seek expert opinion. And moreover, Socrates says, look at the lives of the great men. Look at Pericles. Pericles, who was a great statesman, a general in Athens and presided over a golden age of sorts. Look at Pericles. Look at his sons. He has an abundance of political excellence, of this arete, but his sons do not. And similarly with other great people, why do great men not not teach their sons arete, or even send them off to be taught arete? And sort of this seemed like an interesting question, but well, it's an appeal to sort of popular wisdom and established wisdom. And it's very improbable that both should be wrong, but only improbable. And Protagoras makes quite a capable response. He says that in a society, all men must have some measure, all men must have a great measure of civic virtue, of political, of citizenship, in order for a community to exist. So if you compare the citizens of Athens to, let's say, the savages that you hear of in the eastern lands, actually, the citizens of Athens are all experts in virtue, and this is why the Athenian assembly goes to them, because actually they are experts in virtue. And what's more, this is also why the great men do not send their children off to be educated in virtue, because they are being taught by everyone. Right from your upbringing, you're told by your nurse, your teachers, to do this, not to do that. And yeah, this seems a pretty convincing thing, but actually, you see here his relativism. He's saying that virtue is actually the collection of social norms and expected behaviors that you find in community. And actually, if you think about it, it's sort of weird that Protagoras, who's a foreigner, he's from Abdera, wherever that is, he comes to Athens and he says, I can teach you your social norms, the qualities that are uniquely in your society result in success. I can teach you this better than all of the people around you. And so sort of in making that response, you can sort of see a bit of a contradiction in Protagoras' stance. Well, Socrates doesn't push this. He takes back. He almost accepts what Protagoras has said, but he picks up on this point. Protagoras, you talk of virtue. Well, you've talked of justice. He does talk of justice, and you've talked of temperance, and you've talked of wisdom and courage. Are these all part of the same thing, or are they all the same? And so we have here a question about whether virtue is one thing or it is many things. Unity versus multiplicity. And roughly you have this sort of collection of virtues which is traditionally established in Greek thought. I think it's justice, temperance, wisdom, piety, and then courage sort of tacked on. Well, Socrates says, surely, if you say they are separate, they must be entirely separate. But if we are to say something can be just but impious, or pious, or unjust, well, that's a monstrosity. And you sort of see that you can get the same thing with wise and temperate. Temperate isn't really a good translation. It's more like acting in a morally correct and beneficial manner. But essentially he says that temperance and wisdom have the common opposite of folly, and each thing can only have one opposite, so if they both have the same opposite, they're the same thing. And through this sort of very Socratic manner, I won't sort of go into it, he goes about proving that the virtues are all actually the same thing. And Protagoras sees this and is unhappy, and he stops it. So Socrates turns around and says, let's appeal to the wisdom of the masses again. And this is sort of interesting because Protagoras is a populist of sorts. Both because he's a relativist and because he has to teach a brand of virtue that people want, he has to assent to listening to what everyone thinks about virtue. And so Socrates says, is it not true that pleasure, purely in terms of pleasure, just isolated pleasure is good, and it's the only good, and it's the only thing to be desired. And the pain, purely in isolation, it's the only thing that is bad. And Protagoras assents to this. And so Socrates goes on to say, well then, all men wish for pleasure, because it would be nonsense to say that anyone willingly goes for pain. Perhaps instead of saying pain and pleasure, we should say, well, happiness and unhappiness. And so all people have the same motive. So the only difference in sort of how much they achieve good and bad, which is sort of the actual the measure of virtue, the only difference is in how able they are. And so in each situation, you have a path that leads to more pleasure and a path that leads to less pleasure. And so actually virtue, which is achieving the most good, the most pleasure, is reduced to a skill of just differentiating between the path of more pleasure and the path of less pleasure. And this skill, this is a calculus. This is a weighing up. This is knowledge. This is virtue is knowledge. And knowledge is the only thing that can be taught. And so we go from the initial stance, where Socrates is saying, no, you can't teach knowledge. And now we get to this point where, the initial stance is Socrates saying you can't teach virtue. Now we get to the stance where Socrates says virtue is knowledge, and knowledge is really the only thing that you can teach. And this is really the focus of my investigation. Now, Protagoras is very interesting for a host of reasons. The text is interesting for a great host of reasons. But there's this sort of double paradox here. So first of all, you have Socrates making two contradictory statements about the nature of arete. And secondly, actually, we find, that there are substantial contradictions in the way that he goes about proving these two stances. So, just looking at the first stance, that virtue is not teachable, well, if we just look at this life of Socrates, if we look at, say, the Apology, or well, any of the dialogues, you find he's always questioning people. He questioned the politicians, and he found that they didn't know what they were talking about. He questioned the poets, and he goes through all of this in Apology. And so actually, if you know Socrates, you know that he doesn't readily accept established wisdom. So why does he, in the first stance, appeal to the established wisdom of great men and of the masses? And at the same time, actually, Plato's a notorious anti-democrat. He dislikes democracy greatly. You can see that very clearly in the Republic. He says lots of bad things about it. And he wants to establish a monarchy of the philosophers. And moreover, not only is the sort of the means of this appeal contrary to what we know about Socrates and Plato, the whole idea that virtue cannot be taught is contrary to what we know about Socrates and Plato. Because Socrates spent his whole life engaging in dialectic, in talking to people, trying to reduce ignorance and to bring about knowledge. And this is not unsubstantiated. I can't sort of prove this to you at the moment, but Socrates believes that virtue is knowledge. And so if he's trying to bring about knowledge, he's trying to bring about virtue. And if he didn't think that virtue could be taught, well, how does that explain his life? And so with Plato, in the Republic, he sets out this whole system of education for his philosopher kings. He goes into detail about how young men are to be educated in order that they become virtuous rulers of the state. And so surely he also thinks that virtue can be taught. So we have an apparent contradiction here. And we're inclined to say that actually the stance that virtue can't be taught is not a genuine one. And we'll try to explain that later. Oops. No good. So then we go on to the idea of that the virtues are one. And then this is pretty much classic Socrates. He goes about playing with words. And the same notion is found in all of the earliest Socratic dialogues, I think, well, a lot of them. Charmides, Laches, Lysis. Yeah. And that, we'll pretty much accept that, I think. That is just genuine. But then onto the last and most interesting idea, the hedonistic argument. The hedonistic argument being the idea that pain is good, pleasure is bad. Well, this will strike anyone who is familiar with Plato and Socrates as very strange. I mean, if you just quickly think about the life of Socrates, think about Crito, Socrates could have escaped from his fate. He could have avoided execution, but he doesn't. He didn't, and he didn't because he wanted to preserve the goodness of his soul. And you find this in other dialogues, Plato and Socrates talking about the goodness of the soul over worldly pleasure. And so that's an apparent contradiction. But the important thing here is that you could substitute pain and pleasure for that which is good for the soul and that which is bad for the soul. And it's like he's established a mathematical identity where you can substitute the terms. And so the important thing is the identification of virtue, whatever it may be, with knowledge. Well, you might turn around and say, actually, so it is knowledge. But does that mean that people know it? Does that mean it can be taught? I mean, not all knowledge, not all things that can be known are known and can be taught. And if we think about, in the case of, let's say, courage, you're in a battlefield, you have two options, you can run or fight. One of these is the better course, one of these is the worse course. You cannot know every single circumstance, because every circumstance has a best course of action unique to it. You cannot, and a teacher cannot know every circumstance. So how can a teacher hope to know all of these particular situations in which it is beneficial to this, that, or the other? Well, we can sort of explain this away by referring to Plato's theory of the forms. Now, this is very difficult to explain. This is a big part of Plato, and I don't think I can explain it fully, but essentially to say, we have lots of particulars, we have lots of rabbits, but there's a universal rabbit, there's a perfect heavenly rabbit that all of these rabbits aspire to. So there's a form of the rabbit in which all of these earthly rabbits partake. And the same, you could say, of the form of the situation in which it is beneficial to do X. So if you know the form of acting sort of beneficially, if you can perceive the form of it, you'll be able to recognize its earthly particulars. Can you follow? Yeah. So if we consult materials and forms, you can sort of explain away that. But then, this goes further. The forms cannot be told. They cannot be perfectly produced in the sensible world, that is to say, the world that the senses perceives. They're purely a matter of, they're only intelligible, they're not sensible. Do you see the distinction that I'm making? And what is intelligible is it's private to your own mind. So while you may be able to perceive the form, you can't sort of directly transfer that to another person, because if you were to try to transfer that, you'd be transferring it through the senses, and what goes through the senses is necessarily corrupted. And so actually, well, a person can only perceive the forms for himself. I just hurry up there. So, sophisticated instruction, which is sort of, I tell you this, you listen to it, and you take it to heart. That would be a transference. Whereas Socratic dialectic, which is sort of the process of talking to each other and sort of back and forth, is supposed to produce the understanding of oneself. It's sort of like a mathematical proof. You can be told the result of the proof, but you won't actually understand it until you go through it yourself. That's the idea that's being conveyed. Let's see. So yeah, what's the verdict? Virtue can be taught. But it's a nuanced one, because it can only be taught in a certain way, and it's a certain type of virtue. I think that this explains the two apparently contradictory stances. Because in the first part, what Socrates is actually talking about is... Well, what Socrates is talking about is the Pythagorean conception of virtue, and that's a sort of relativist, multiplicitous, fragmented sort of virtue specific to each type of community. And he doesn't think that can be taught. But once he establishes true virtue, it's one thing, and it's guided by principles, and it's intelligible, well, he thinks that can be taught. And so, yeah, so why did Plato do this? One explanation is entirely to show Socrates' superiority to Protagoras. I mean, we have the young Socrates jumping, sort of running hoops around, running around this supposedly the best intellectual of the age, and Protagoras doesn't know what's going on. He can't follow, and Socrates is sort of taking him at his own thread and beating him at it. At the same time, we're shown that. So yeah, we're shown that it's implausible that Protagoras can teach Athenian virtue. We're also shown that Protagoras sort of doesn't even think that the real virtue, according to Plato, is real, or that it can be taught. And we're also showing that dialectic is the only way to impart true virtue. And and so this says that the purpose of the hedonistic argument is to establish the identity of virtue and knowledge, and to show Protagoras and the common people that even on their own terms, even on their own assumptions, that is to say that pain is good and pain is bad and pleasure is good, even on those assumptions that virtue equals knowledge. Another reason for the potential reason for the switch of stances is it's actually quite sort of entertaining. Plato is a dramatic writer, in addition to a philosopher. He's a poet, and he could have done this. Well, part of the motivation could have been for dramatic irony. And yeah, I need to hurry things. I don't like hurrying things. So ultimately, what I see the three stances are. Is the first stance is to resist Protagoras and to exposit the Protagorean account of virtue and to show its flaws. The second part asserts the Socratic conception of virtue, and the third part is convincing others that this is the right conception of virtue. Yeah. So at the end of this, why? Why bother studying Protagoras? Why bother reading Plato? Well, we can sort of see, obviously, that the subjects of Protagoras are relevant today and will always be relevant. Education, virtue, and morality can virtually be taught. But well, actually, the idea of the existence of variety itself is controversial, but we don't all accept that. Plato's forms have their own problems. I mean, for example, do you have the form of a tabby cat? Do you have a form of a tabby cat with one less whisker? Like the specificity of the forms is a major flaw, and so like we can't entirely accept the forms either. So sort of Plato's argument doesn't really work today. And actually, in the matter of education, well, we are rightly guided today by educational psychology rather than the musings of Plato. But still, it's important that Plato chose not to present his theories in neat, clean treatises, because even though we may reject the findings of Protagoras, there remains a dialectic method, the method of the idea of making the reader think, because it's not a treatise. The answer is not served to you on a plate. You're given these sort of different stances, you're given these different arguments, and you're made to think. And that's the important thing about reading Plato, and that's the important thing about studying philosophy. The ultimate goal isn't to get the answers, it's about the process of thinking, and it's about broadening the mind. It's sort of like running. You might go running not to just get somewhere. You run to get fitter, and in the same way you study philosophy to improve your own mind. It is a personal thing, but doesn't mean it's not worth it. So yeah, ultimately you do this for the simple human love of contemplation. I mean, you might have a world in which all material wants are met, but it could still well be miserable. There could be no poverty and no disease, but it still wouldn't be perfect. And that's a sort of general defense of philosophy and humanity here. So that's the end of that. I hope you've understood everything. I hope. Yeah. Any questions?